Itorah, developed by Grimbart Tales and published by Assemble Entertainment, is a traditional and accessible 2.5D action platformer with some very streamlined Metroidvania elements. You take control of the titular Itorah, a young human girl, and seemingly the last of her kind, who awakens in a verdant future inhabited by anthropomorphic races that worship balance in nature. However, the lands of the Nahukin have begun to change, and the local fauna, and some of the flora, have become increasingly hostile, corrupted by a malevolent plague seeping from an ancient ruin. Itorah is immediately paired up with an enchanting talking axe that, as a small human child, she wields with lethal efficiency. After a lengthy prologue gets you to grips with the basic gameplay mechanics, she stumbles upon an amateur archaeologist with a fondness for explosives and exploring forbidden human ruins. Itorah accompanies her on a scouting expedition to discover the source of the plague, which leads them into some uncomfortably familiar ruins, complete with advanced equipment, cultish decor, and scrawled references to Xibalba, the Mayan underworld. One desperate escape later, and they find themselves on a new quest to save the world, using Itorah's power to absorb corruption, seemingly with no side effects. It's an intriguing enough setup that provides a solid excuse to traverse the realm, purify nature guardians, discover the source of the plague, and try to defeat it once and for all. Itorah's gameplay and level design are both refreshingly straightforward, but perhaps a little too familiar for their own good. You've got the 2D combat, with a strong focus on dodging, positioning, and utilizing directional power moves to defeat enemies and bosses. Your foes, though beautifully animated, have a fairly limited moveset and full specific roles. Think nimble flyer that complicates platforming, stationary projectile spewers, brain-dead charges, or slow but incredibly damaging tanks. As both the dodge and attack animations offer up a generous number of iframes, the challenge comes from juggling multiple enemy types or trying to reach a boss's weak spot while avoiding damage. While Itorah's bosses certainly look intimidating, they're also a little gimmicky. Once you realize how you need to defeat them, it's simply a case of surviving several attack cycles before emerging victorious. With no alternate weapons and no option to upgrade your damage output directly, combat mastery requires careful movement and timing, and the responsive controls are up to the task. Talking of movement and timing, traversal is your typical mix of jumps, double jumps, and wall jumps, modified by several power moves that offer secondary functionality. You'll explore some truly massive areas, which make full use of the 2D map space, leaping chasms, jumping between ledges and grapple points, dodging a myriad of trap types, and collecting keys to open doors. Enemies are, of course, thrown into the mix to complicate these sections, and you'll also tackle several tense escape sequences that serve as an alternative to boss fights, though thankfully with mercifully placed checkpoints. Once again, the responsive controls shine during these moments. Now, there were definitely some streamlined elements I enjoyed in Itorah. The limited number of sequential upgrades on offer are simply tied to defeating enemies for shards and secret hunting. All you need are a few petrified memories or pale feathers to increase Itorah's health and stamina, or the number of healing spells she has and their efficacy. I generally hate grinding for dozens of resource types when they all serve the same purpose, so this is a good change from the status quo. What I found less enjoyable was the by-the-numbers approach to ability upgrades, the predictable level design, and, most problematically, several overlong zones. Now, whenever Itorah presents you with two paths, one will always be blocked until you find the correct ability shrine down the other path. At that point, you'll be faced with a lengthy zone, with progression almost exclusively driven by that new ability, leading to some sort of roadblock, followed by a long detour to acquire a key item, followed by a boss or escape sequence. Now sure, it's a classic design, but Itorah's developers needed to show more restraint. You'll spend so much time using a new ability to progress, it feels simultaneously overused for that zone and underutilized everywhere else. Unfortunately, the streamlined upgrade system that I like means there are usually only one or two secrets per massive area, resulting in locations that just simply feel big for the sake of padding. A constant highlight, though also somewhat undermined by repetition in larger zones, is the Mesoamerican-inspired visuals and soundtrack. The beautiful hand-drawn backdrops are perhaps the most vibrant and striking feature, but you'll soon notice the detailed character models, intricate animations that give combat impact, and the expressive faces that make up for a lack of voice work. There are few locations that wouldn't make for a great screenshot, while a few moving parts ensure the world still feels alive. There's also the impressive use of lighting to create cinematic moments, like creeping through oppressive darkness, or battling in silhouette against the setting sun. The enchanting soundtrack primarily uses string instruments with a distinct Central American vibe, but it's also dynamic, able to shift tempo based on the on-screen action, or transition smoothly as you move between areas. Again, given the lack of voice acting, it does a great job of providing an emotional component in several dialogue sequences. It's clear the presentation was designed as a core part of Itorah's experience, and it carries a lot of weight, especially in light of some of the aforementioned gameplay issues. All things considered, Itorah leaves me torn. The premise and characters are intriguing, the visuals and soundtrack elevate every scene, and I certainly enjoyed the traditional and streamlined gameplay loop for a few hours. However, for a game that's easily 10 plus hours on a casual playthrough, that traditional and formulaic design, coupled with several zones that dragged on for far too long, and a generally low difficulty, all left me increasingly disengaged. Of course, this is subjective, but the more I played, the more I began to feel like I was going through the motions, or waiting on the next story beat or inspiring backdrop to keep me hooked.